Hi, my name is Ben Still, and I teach saxophone at UNC Charlotte. And I'd like to take a few moments to speak about the 11-12 All-State saxophone solo for the 2021-2022 North Carolina school year. This year for the 11-12 group, the solo is a Sonata in A minor by C.P.E. Bach. It's originally written for flute, but it's been transcribed, in this case, for the saxophone. So my first piece of advice, as you start to prepare this piece for your auditions, would be to listen to a lot of flute recordings of this piece being performed. I think that's really, really valuable because for any transcription, we're trying to, in some ways, emulate the original instrument. Even though we don't play flute, we're playing it on the saxophone. We want to try to graft as many of those sound characteristics, as well as musical qualities, from the flute performances into our saxophone playing. So I would certainly recommend going to YouTube or Spotify or any other streaming service. You can even go find it on iTunes or find a CD of it. Those are all really valuable resources, and I would listen to a large variety of them. Through my own listening, that's how I actually figured out how to perform those staccato notes. I do find them to be a challenge at first because the tempo of this first movement is quite slow, and if we try to play them really, really short at such a slow tempo, they feel or they sound maybe a little weird. They feel too short, and there's like a lot of dead space between that note and then the slurred eighth notes that typically follow them in this first movement. And by listening to some flute recordings, I realized that the flutists were mainly pressing on those notes and providing a taper at the end of them, and then just a little bit of space in between that note and the slurred eighth notes that followed it. And so I was able to pick that up from listening to recordings. Another thing that I picked up from recordings was the contrast and dynamics. These dynamics are subito, which is another word for suddenly. And so we want to play with sudden dynamic shifts. So the first note, for instance, in the first measure, we're going to play with a nice strong sound. You kind of press on the note, and then the next slurred eighth notes that we see that follow it should be really soft and really reflect that lightness that the flute can really get from its sound. And but the dynamic shift is sudden, and so I would recommend really looking out for those dynamic shifts and making sure that you're really contrasting them, not only articulation-wise but dynamically. And the third thing that I picked up from recordings was a lot of the flute performers that I was listening to were playing with a great sense of rubato, which is these slight pushes and pulls in time, where they're leaning on certain notes and they're stretching the time just ever so slightly of certain notes. And then the notes that follow it were maybe sped up just a little bit to make up that time. And so I would certainly encourage you, as you're preparing this, to explore some rubato and see how you can work that into your daily practicing and performing of this etude, of this piece. And the rubato is sometimes tricky to do because we can maybe do too much of it, where it's overdone and it doesn't really fit the intended rhythms that Bach has written. And sometimes we don't do any rubato, and then it feels really sort of straight ahead, and it doesn't feel as musical as we want it. So I picked up a lot of that stuff again from listening to some really great flute performers. So those are my three recommendations for this movement. You might be wondering, well, what about the ornamentation? And the ornamentation is important, but I want to really emphasize that your early practice sessions should maybe actually leave the ornamentation out and just practice the dynamics, the articulations, as well as just the overall push and pull or the ebb and flow of the musical line before adding in those ornamentations. I think that's really important. But specifically the ornamentations, from a fingering standpoint, most of them you're going to use what I would maybe call standard fingerings. For instance, in the second measure, you have a D natural to C. So on my B, I'm fingering a B, and then I just move to the palm key D and move to the C, and it's quite quick. And then I do the same thing for the grace notes in the fourth measure, B, D, C. I'm using just the regular palm key. But then we have a turn in measure 5. And for that one, I'm using, it starts on a B, and then you're going to go up to a C, down to a B, down to an A, back up to a B. But for that C, I'm using my alternate C key or my side C, which we perform that by holding down our B fingering, our normal B fingering, and rather than flipping, which can be a little clunky, sometimes the fingering timing can get a little messed up in there, and we can get extra notes that we don't want. We can add our middle side key right here while holding down our B key, and that plays a C natural. So I do that turn by going B, C, B, A, B, and that way I can avoid flipping. And then the trill in measure 8, I'm using my alternate D fingering, which would be I'm holding down my C, and instead of trilling C to D, it's kind of clunky, a little loud, it's not very smooth, and kind of pulls us out from a timbral perspective of where we're at musically. I actually use my alternate D, which is this second palm key. If I hold down a C, my normal C fingering, and then I press down that palm key, that creates a D. It's not a particularly good sounding D. It's not something I would really, lean on for long beats at a time in this instance, but it works in a situation where we need to do a fast trill, and our ear doesn't pick up as much on that timbral difference. So that's the fingering I would use there. Looking down further in measure 20, that turn is quite quick. It's going to be G, A, G, F natural, and then G. And that's got to all happen in the span of that 1/16th note. But in my recording, I actually stretched that note just a little bit, and then I sped through on the back half of that, the E and the F. I provided a little space for myself to perform that turnaround so that I could get all the notes in and it didn't feel rushed or I was missing a note or something like that. And then just scanning the rest of the piece, I see a grace note measure 24, that's G to F. I see a trill at the end of that line, measure 29, that one's going to be D to E. In measure 31, I'm going F to E flat, so D, F, E flat. Same thing a couple bars later. And then of course at the very end of the first movement, there's another trill from D to E, and then I end on my C. For our second movement, again, I'm going to reference using a flute recording to pick up on some of the musical styles that would be performed on a piece like this. One thing I noticed is there are some staccatos marked in here. And for those we really want to maybe play them really short. But for my articulated notes that don't have any articulation markings, I wouldn't say that I was trying to play them staccato, but I certainly was trying to at least play them with a lightness, really light articulation. We don't want a really heavy tongue. So that's something I would kind of keep throughout this in the back of my mind while I'm performing is, oh, I should try to aim to play a little bit lighter. It's really easy to play super heavy. There are a few instances where I do hold articulated notes out full value, particularly when there's like half steps, and hopefully you can pick that up in the recording. But my overall sort of idea for the second movement, because it is quite quick, is just to play with an overall sense of lightness and that light articulation style. Again, not necessarily staccato and short, but that just a lighter, more lifted articulation style contrasts nicely with slurred notes that usually follow those articulations. One thing I would recommend is also taking it really slow and playing it really slow for a long time. There's no rush to get this up to tempo at this stage. Don't try to get this to dotted chord note equals 60 or 70 like tomorrow. It is something that you could, or I would recommend, to practice slowly for a long time. And while you're practicing slowly, not only are you trying to obviously get notes and rhythms, those are very, very important, but you're also trying to figure out the musical style at a lower tempo so that your ear picks up on, this is how I'm hearing this to be played musically. And you'll find that then getting the tempo up, you can carry those musical characteristics, the lightness of articulations, even things like the ornamentation. You can carry those with you as you ascend the metronome into whatever your target tempo is. So that's my second recommendation for this. And then of course, third, very similarly to the first movement, we have some subito dynamics here. And so trying to really contrast those when you play soft, try to play super soft, play loud, play really nice and strong. Those make it interesting. And was a challenge to do those dynamics at a faster tempo. And so again, playing it really slow helps to train our ear of, oh yeah, that needs to be piano. And it sounds weird maybe when I don't play piano. And as you pick up the tempo, you'll carry those dynamics with you. So for the ornamentation in here, there's another trill at measure 12 where you're going to use C to D. So you can use that alternate D key right there. Scanning just a little bit further, it looks like measure 28, you have a G to A right there. And then just a little further, I know we have a grace note at the very end. So you're going to re-articulate that D sharp. If you look at the second to last measure, it ends on a D sharp and you're tonguing all those notes. And then you have to really quickly re-articulate the D sharp before moving to the E. So just make sure you re-articulate that one. Otherwise, it doesn't sound like a grace note. And try your best to put that grace note in the very last measure on the downbeat. Okay. But anyway, I hope these tips were slightly helpful. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to reach me at bstill@uncc.edu. And I wish you the best of luck in your preparation and happy practicing.